August 1, 1944. Dawn breaks over the hedgerows of Normandy, casting long shadows across fields still scarred by artillery fire. In a requisitioned farmhouse near Avranches, a German oberst leans over a map table, his coffee cold, his eyes red from sleepless nights. Outside, the rumble of distant engines mingles with the morning birdsong, a sound that has become as constant as breathing. He lights a cigarette, exhales slowly, and mutters to his adjutant, "They cannot sustain this. No army can." On the map before him, red pins mark American positions, advancing faster than any logistical system should allow. The Oberst has been trained at the finest military academies in Europe. He has studied Napoleon's campaigns, read Clausewitz, analyzed the great maneuvers of history. And everything he knows tells him that the Americans, now 60 miles inland and accelerating, are overextending themselves into a catastrophic supply collapse. It is only a matter of days, he believes, before their tanks run dry and their offensive sputters into the French countryside like a spent storm. He does not yet understand that he is witnessing something unprecedented in the history of warfare, not a logistical system, but a logistical revolution. The German military mind in the summer of 1944 operated from a position of hard-earned experience and rational calculation. For 5 years, the Wehrmacht had demonstrated itself as perhaps the most efficient fighting force the world had ever seen. Their blitzkrieg doctrine, lightning war, relied on concentrated armor spearheads supported by tactical air power, smashing through enemy lines and penetrating deep into rear areas before defenders could react. But this doctrine carried within it an inherent limitation that every German staff officer understood. Speed consumed supply. Tanks devoured fuel. Artillery pieces demanded shells. Soldiers required food, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement parts. The farther and faster an army advanced, the longer and more fragile its supply lines became. History was littered with the corpses of armies that had outrun their logistics. Napoleon's Grand Armée had starved in Russia. The German Sixth Army had frozen at Stalingrad. Every military professional knew the iron law. No matter how brilliant the tactics, no matter how brave the soldiers, an army without supply was merely armed men waiting to die. The German logistical system, like everything in the Wehrmacht, was built on meticulous planning and rigid efficiency. Horse-drawn wagons still carried the majority of supplies to German infantry divisions. Over 500,000 horses served in the Wehrmacht throughout the war, a fact that would have astonished those who saw only the propaganda images of motorized columns. The Germans had calculated precisely how many tons of supplies a division required per day, how many trucks could traverse a given road network, how many railheads could be operational behind the advancing front. Their system worked because it was conservative, carefully controlled, and based on realistic assessments of what was possible. When German officers analyzed the American breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, they applied these same calculations and concluded that the American advance must inevitably stall. The Americans had landed on beaches and were pushing inland across a destroyed French infrastructure. The railroads were bombed. The roads were clogged. The ports were either captured but damaged or still in German hands. By every rational metric, the American Third Army under General George S. Patton should have ground to a halt somewhere around the Seine River, its tanks empty, its men hungry, its momentum shattered against the mathematics of supply and distance. But Patton's tanks did not stop at the Seine. They did not stop at the Meuse. They rolled across France like an iron flood, covering distances in days that had taken armies weeks in previous wars. Between August 1 and September 1, 1944, the Third Army advanced over 400 miles, liberated territory containing millions of people, captured tens of thousands of German soldiers, and maintained offensive operations across a front spanning hundreds of miles. German commanders watched this with growing confusion, then disbelief, then something approaching dread. It violated everything they understood about logistics. It should not have been possible. And yet, day after day, the red pins on their maps retreated eastward, pushed by an American army that somehow never ran out of fuel, never paused for resupply, never gave the Wehrmacht the breathing space it desperately needed to establish a coherent defensive line. The Germans kept waiting for the inevitable American supply crisis. It never came. What the German officers could not see, what they had no framework to comprehend, was the scale of American industrial power translated into military logistics. Behind Patton's spearheads, across the beaches of Normandy and through the shattered port of Cherbourg, flowed a river of supply unlike anything warfare had ever witnessed. More than 20,000 trucks operated in the communications zone behind the American front lines, organized into an improvised but staggeringly effective system that would come to be known as the Red Ball Express. These were not military innovations in the traditional sense, not new weapons or radical tactics. They were simply trucks, GMC 2.5-ton cargo vehicles, Dodge 3/4-ton weapons carriers, standard commercial designs adapted for military use and manufactured in quantities that defied European imagination. The United States produced nearly 3 million military trucks during World War II, more trucks than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. These vehicles were not particularly sophisticated. They were reliable, standardized, and above all, numerous. And in the hands of American logisticians, they became the weapon that won the race across France. The Red Ball Express began operations on August 25, 1944, as an emergency measure to keep Patton's advance supplied. The system was brutally simple: dedicated truck routes marked with red balls, one-way traffic, no stops except for breakdowns, maximum speed, continuous operations day and night. Truck companies would load supplies at the Normandy depots, drive through the night to forward supply dumps near the advancing front, unload, and immediately return for another load. The drivers, nearly 75% of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, drove 24-hour shifts, navigating blacked-out roads, dodging occasional German air attacks, fighting exhaustion and mechanical breakdowns to keep the supply line flowing. In its first 3 months of operation, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies, covering round-trip distances of up to 700 miles. The trucks themselves became a symbol, not sleek or dramatic, but unstoppable, arriving in such numbers that German soldiers began to speak of the American vehicles with a kind of bitter awe. One captured German officer, interviewed after the war, said simply, "We could not understand where so many trucks came from. It seemed you could destroy 10 and 20 more would appear." The German expectation had been reasonable, even sophisticated. They knew the Americans were wealthy, that American factories produced vast quantities of material. But wealth alone did not translate into battlefield logistics. The Germans themselves had enormous industrial capacity. They produced more tanks in 1944 than in any previous year of the war. What the Germans failed to grasp was not American production, but American logistics, the unglamorous, often invisible science of moving supply from factory to battlefield with relentless efficiency. The United States had spent the previous decade building the most advanced transportation infrastructure on Earth. Tens of thousands of miles of paved highways, standardized railroad gauges, mechanized loading equipment, containerized shipping methods developed by commercial industry. When war came, this civilian infrastructure transformed into military advantage. American soldiers arrived in Europe trained not just to fight, but to load trucks efficiently, maintain vehicles in the field, organize supply dumps with industrial precision. Behind every American tank rolling across France stood a logistics system that treated warfare as an industrial process, one that could be standardized, streamlined, and scaled to previously unimaginable levels. The German army, by contrast, was fighting a pre-industrial war with industrial weapons. Their logistics remained dependent on methods that would have been familiar to Napoleon. Horse-drawn wagons, commandeered civilian vehicles of wildly varying types and capabilities, supply systems that required constant improvisation and accepted shortages as inevitable. A single German panzer division might include trucks manufactured by a dozen different companies, each requiring different spare parts, different fuel grades, different maintenance procedures. When these vehicles broke down, and they broke down frequently, repairs became a nightmare of scavenged parts and field expedients. The Wehrmacht's logistics operated on the principle of calculated scarcity. Never quite enough supply, but hopefully sufficient if carefully rationed and skillfully managed. German officers were trained to achieve victory despite logistical limitations. They were not prepared for an enemy who simply eliminated those limitations through brute industrial force. The psychological impact of this disparity manifested in small moments that accumulated into crushing realization. A German supply officer, retreating through France in late August, recorded in his diary the surreal experience of being overtaken by American supply columns. "We moved east with our remaining trucks and horse carts," he wrote, "and watched the enemy trucks pass us on parallel roads, hundreds of them, moving west, laden with fuel and ammunition and food, an endless procession that continued through the day and into the night. Our men asked, 'Where do they all come from? How can there be so many?' We had no answer. German soldiers had spent years fighting on fronts where supply was precious, where ammunition had to be conserved, where going days without adequate food was common. They retreated now past American supply dumps that contained more materiel than entire German army groups possessed. Mountains of jerry cans filled with gasoline, stacks of ammunition crates, warehouses of rations, spare parts, medical supplies, all guarded casually by a handful of soldiers, because there was simply too much to worry about theft or loss. The abundance was incomprehensible. It spoke of an economy so vast, so productive, that it could afford to be wasteful, could afford to stockpile supplies in forward areas just in case they might be needed, could afford to discard damaged equipment rather than repair it, could afford to provide every soldier with quantities of food and clothing that German troops could only dream of. The symbolic power of the truck itself grew in German consciousness throughout the autumn of 1944. Unlike tanks, which were dramatic and obvious instruments of warfare, the trucks were mundane, commercial vehicles painted olive drab and filled with supplies. But they appeared in such overwhelming numbers that they became emblematic of American industrial power in a way that more sophisticated weapons did not. A German infantryman could rationalize being outgunned by American artillery, outmaneuvered by American tanks. These were the fortunes of war, the kind of tactical disadvantages that skill and courage might overcome. But the trucks, the simple fact that the Americans could field 20,000 vehicles in a single logistical system, represented something different. It was not a tactical advantage, but a systemic one, a demonstration that the war was not being fought between armies, but between industrial civilizations of wildly different scales. Every truck that rolled past a German position was a reminder that behind the American front line stood an economy producing vehicles faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them, delivering supplies more rapidly than German forces could consume their own dwindling stocks. The trucks were a message written in steel and rubber. You cannot win this through courage or skill or determination, because you are not fighting soldiers, you are fighting factories. Patton himself understood this, though he often clothed his understanding in theatrical language. He called his Third Army a fighting machine with a motor in place of a heart, and insisted that gasoline is as much a weapon as bullets. He drove his staff relentlessly, demanding more speed, more aggression, more forward momentum, but he never forgot that aggression required fuel. When supply difficulties did emerge in September 1944, as the Allied logistics finally reached their temporary limits, Patton raged against the constraints with characteristic bombast, but he also lobbied, negotiated, and schemed to secure every gallon of gasoline, every shell, every spare part his army needed. He understood that modern warfare had become as much about supply velocity as tactical velocity, that the army which could sustain its advance would eventually overwhelm the army that could not, regardless of tactical brilliance. The German commanders facing him understood this too, but understanding brought no solution. They could see what was happening, could calculate the imbalance, but they possessed no counter. You cannot outmaneuver supply. You cannot use tactical skill to defeat industrial capacity. All they could do was retreat, conserve their dwindling resources, and hope that the American logistics would eventually outrun themselves into vulnerability. But the trucks kept coming. The experience of individual German soldiers during this period carried a peculiar psychological weight. Many Wehrmacht veterans had fought on the Eastern Front, where they had witnessed the Soviet Union's own form of overwhelming material superiority. Endless waves of T-34 tanks, artillery barrages that turned entire landscapes into moonscapes, masses of infantry that seemed to regenerate no matter how many were killed. The Eastern Front had taught German soldiers to expect material disadvantage. But the Eastern Front had also been chaotic, brutal, a war of improvisation where Soviet logistics were often as poor as German, where both sides scrambled for supply and made do with shortages. France in 1944 was different. The Americans advanced with an orderliness that seemed almost leisurely, not because they were slow, but because they were never desperate. Their supply system worked so reliably that they could afford to be methodical. German soldiers surrendering to American forces in the fall of 1944 experienced a jarring transition from the scarcity of the Wehrmacht to the abundance of the American military. They were fed hot meals from field kitchens that arrived on schedule. They received medical treatment using supplies that appeared unlimited. They were transported to prisoner camps in the same trucks that brought supplies forward, vehicles that, having delivered fuel and ammunition to the front, carried prisoners on the return trip rather than running empty. The efficiency was simultaneously impressive and demoralizing. Even in defeat, even as prisoners, they were being processed by a system of such scale and competence that resistance seemed futile. By late autumn of 1944, as American forces approached the German border, the initial German confidence about inevitable American supply collapse had transformed into bitter acceptance. Intelligence officers compiled reports analyzing American logistics with a kind of academic thoroughness born of necessity, studying the truck companies, the supply procedures, the maintenance systems, trying to identify weaknesses that might be exploited. They found few. The American system was not elegant or sophisticated by German standards. It was often improvisational, with decisions made by junior officers on the spot rather than flowing from careful central planning. But it worked because it operated from abundance rather than scarcity. When a truck broke down, the Americans often simply abandoned it and requisitioned another. There were always more trucks. When supplies ran low in one sector, entire convoys were diverted to address the shortage. There was enough total supply to afford flexibility. The Germans, accustomed to systems where every vehicle was precious and every supply calculation was tight, watched this apparent wastefulness with incomprehension. It violated their sense of proper military organization. But it worked, and that was all that mattered. The transformation in German strategic thinking during these months was subtle but profound. Before Normandy, German defensive planning had assumed that Allied logistics would limit offensive operations, that even if the Western Allies established a beachhead, they would require months to build up sufficient supply for a major breakout. This assumption had shaped German dispositions, reinforcement schedules, defensive construction. When the breakout came, and more importantly, when it sustained itself week after week, German planners were forced to recalculate. The memos and situation reports from this period, preserved in captured German documents, show a growing realization that the war in the West was unwinnable not because of tactical defeats, but because of systemic imbalance. A report from the German Army High Command in September 1944 noted with stark clarity, "The enemy possesses logistical capabilities that exceed our previous estimates by at least a factor of 3. Defensive operations must account for the fact that the enemy can sustain offensive operations indefinitely across multiple fronts simultaneously." This was not defeatism but realism, an acknowledgement that Germany faced an enemy whose industrial base could supply armies faster than those armies could consume supplies. The trucks themselves, those unglamorous GMC 2.5-ton vehicles, became artifacts of memory for those who witnessed them. In the decades after the war, German veterans would sometimes mention them in memoirs and interviews, not with the fear or respect accorded to American tanks or aircraft, but with a kind of weary recognition of what they had represented. "The tanks could be stopped," one former Panzer commander recalled. "We destroyed many tanks, but the trucks, there were always more trucks. That was when you knew the war was lost, when you saw the trucks and understood that they would never stop coming." The trucks carried with them a message about the nature of American power, not dramatic or heroic, but inexorable, grounded in industrial capacity so vast that it could afford to be ordinary. The United States had not invented some brilliant new technology or revolutionary tactic. It had simply applied industrial mass production to warfare with a thoroughness that left no room for enemy countermeasures. You could not defeat the trucks through superior strategy or tactics because they were not a military problem. They were an economic one, and the economics were insurmountable. In the final accounting of why Germany lost the war in the West, the trucks merit their place alongside more celebrated factors: Allied air superiority, numerical advantage, tactical competence. The Third Army's dash across France shattered German defensive planning and created the conditions for eventual Allied victory in 1945. That dash was made possible by American soldiers, certainly, by Patton's aggressive leadership, by tactical decisions and battlefield courage. But it was sustained, mile after mile and day after day, by trucks. 20,000 trucks, driven around the clock by soldiers whose names are mostly forgotten, carrying fuel and ammunition and food through French nights, maintaining an advance that should have been impossible but became instead the defining moment when German commanders realized they faced an enemy that had industrialized warfare itself. The Germans had expected the Americans to fight like a European army, constrained by European concepts of logistics and supply. Instead, they encountered something new. An army that treated supply as an engineering problem to be solved through industrial application, that met every logistical challenge not with careful rationing, but with overwhelming abundance. The epilogue to this story extends beyond France, beyond even the war itself. The Red Ball Express ceased operations in November 1944, its mission accomplished, its name already passing into legend. The trucks themselves mostly survived the war, standard vehicles requiring no special care, driven until peace came, and then sold or scrapped or repurposed for civilian use. But what they represented, the American approach to warfare as industrial process, the willingness to solve military problems through material abundance rather than tactical elegance, this became a defining characteristic of American military power for generations. The lesson the Germans learned in France in 1944 was one that many other nations would learn in the decades to follow. You cannot outfight an enemy who can outproduce you, cannot win through skill alone when your opponent possesses both skill and resources in quantities you cannot match. The trucks were not symbols of American courage or American virtue. They were symbols of American capacity. The simple fact that the United States possessed an industrial economy so vast that it could dedicate 20,000 vehicles to a single supply operation, and consider this a routine logistical matter rather than an extraordinary commitment. And against such capacity, applied with competent determination, even the formidable Wehrmacht found itself helpless. In the end, perhaps, that German Oberst in his farmhouse near Avranches was not wrong in his calculations. By all historical precedent, by all military logic, the American advance should have outrun its supply and collapsed into chaos. That it did not, that Patton's tanks rolled on through August and into September, always fed, always fueled, always moving, this was the true revolution. Not a revolution in tactics or technology, but in scale. The Americans had simply brought so much, so many trucks, so much fuel, so much supply, that they overwhelmed the very concept of logistical limitation. They had, in effect, changed the rules of warfare through sheer industrial force. And the German officers who had mocked the possibility of American logistical success learned, too late, that sometimes quantity possesses a quality all its own.